Hello, this is Scott Jentz. Welcome to Sandbox Stories. Hello, welcome to the Sandbox Story, in which I'm going to combine storytelling with interviews. I'm excited to have you along on this exploration. If I ask you, who was your most impactful patient ever? Can you think of a name right away? When delivering eye care services, we have the distinct pleasure to truly connect with so many patients and their stories. I have positive memories of so many wonderful people I saw over 25 years of patient care. But there was one person that stood out, Mr. Erwin Deutsch. Today on Sandbox Stories, I'm thrilled to be telling his compelling stories, along with some of his family members who will join me in just a little while. Mr. Deutsch was a tremendous man. He visited our clinic regularly for eye health management services, often being on site 3 or 4 times a year. Everyone loved him. I was so enthralled with his stories that the staff got to booking extra time on my schedule to allow for our long discussions in the exam room. Before his passing, he gave me his personally written memoirs, a gift that I cherish, along with the strict rules of how to tell his stories properly based upon the age of the audience. All of what I share with you today is directly from the experiences and knowledge of Mr. Deutsch. His Jewish family was from Breslau, one of the largest cities in Germany before World War II, but which today is part of Poland. His family record in Breslau dated back to 1771. He was born in 1916, one of 4 children, all born while Germany was still a monarchy. The family ran a wholesale grain and seed business and were reasonably positioned in the middle class. Germany became a republic after World War I and ultimately had 5 major political parties vying for leadership, one being the Nazis. Leading up to the 1932 presidential election in Germany, his father, who was a friend of one of the moderate candidates, held an organizational meeting that happened in their home. Mr. Deutsch, a 16-year-old, was allowed to observe from the corner of the room as the men collaborated on the campaign that they hoped would disallow Adolf Hitler from assuming power. Unfortunately, the election was won by a man who immediately appointed Hitler to the role of chancellor in 1933. In his memoir, Mr. Deutsch reflected back on that time and pointed out that one of the men in the room in 1932, who was not helpful to the moderate candidate, later wrote to Mr. Deutsch's father in 1947 saying, quote, "I wished I would have listened to you in 1932. Because you can go to your grave knowing that you tried to prevent the Holocaust. I have to go to my grave knowing if I would have had your insight, I could have saved the death of 6 million Jews and uncounted millions of innocent people. The fatalities of a civil war would have been a fraction of the people who died at the hands of the Nazis." Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s leveraged an incredible propaganda machine. He immediately passed the Enabling Act, which allowed the government to surveil and target people, and he quickly ordered a boycott of all Jewish stores. By 1936, the Nuremberg laws were passed, taking citizenship away from the Jews. Mr. Deutsch was actively participating in moving young people away from Germany over the border to Czechoslovakia, particularly because he was such a good snow skier. He said that he was lucky because he didn't look Jewish and he was blonde. He avoided much trouble along the way, but he did get into the occasional dust-up, and for that he used judo for protection. Mr. Deutsch became engaged to his girlfriend at a time when he was dealing with increasing scrutiny and gimmicks by the government to take away business and money from any Jewish person. He avoided some attention by tearing up the registration card that was expected to be on file for every Jew. He and his wife were married in 1938, just a month before Kristallnacht, in which Nazis burned synagogues and broke windows at the businesses and homes of Jewish people. With that moment of unrest upon them, they moved in with his parents. But quickly, the Nazis came for his father, his brother-in-law, his two uncles, like so many others. With hope of finding his father and uncle, he essentially volunteered himself to be put on the train to the Nazi concentration camp at Buchenwald. He rode on the train, and then upon his arrival, he had his head shaved, and he was placed alongside the other 12,000 men who were worked to death, literally. He tried vigilantly to find his father, who was in another barrack, by going out in the dark of night to use the big pit in the ground that was to be a latrine. He would whisper to others with the hope of not getting caught, for if he were, he would have been shot and his body pushed into the pit with so many others. Eventually, he found his father, and sometimes he found some sympathetic Nazi officers, but they were rare. He witnessed the most unimaginably inhumane treatment, with essentially no food or showers, and there were beatings and killings on top of all of that. In a stroke of odd fortune from misfortune, when his father had a heart attack, they were provided a release. All of this was associated with signing papers to agree to leave the country within a month by the last day of 1938. They got out of Buchenwald. From all of these incredible circumstances, living barely at the edge of life after a month in Buchenwald, he said about his time in the concentration camp, quote, "I made up my mind. I will never forget, but I will not let it haunt me. Now a new life is beginning." He and his wife left Germany via ship to Bolivia with a stop at Ellis Island. They couldn't get into the U.S. as there was a limit on Germans being accepted. And then it was only those that could demonstrate they had family members in the U.S. that could financially support them. Others in his family were not so fortunate. His sister and her husband and family never got out of Germany and were never heard from again. Mr. Deutsch lived in Bolivia for many years before moving to the United States to be near his sister. From Louisiana to Wyoming to Wisconsin, Mr. Deutsch became ingrained in American life. All the while, this patient, thoughtful, hard-working, family-focused man positively influenced everyone that he met. Later in his life, he took the collection of over 1,000 laws passed by the Nazis against Jews between 1933 and 1945, and he translated many of them to English. And he developed a manner of telling his stories, including age-appropriate versions to school children. He was an impactful man, but instead of hearing more about it from me, let's now hear about it from his daughter and his granddaughter. Hello, and welcome to the Sandbox Story, which is an interview with the family of my favorite, most impactful patient of all time, Mr. Erwin Deutsch. I'm honored to have his daughter, Renate Bennett, and his granddaughter, Tamara Braun, here to represent his memories. Welcome, both of you, to Sandbox Stories.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great thrill.
Good to be here.
It's a great thrill. Renate, let's talk about your father. As a young man, he found the love of his life in your mother. How did they meet?
They met after school. My mother was in a different, younger class, and they were in a gym class, and she broke her arm, and she was carrying her books in one arm, and he saw her, and he thought she was so cute. She had these long pigtails, and he offered to carry her books back home and bring her to her home, and that's how they met. And they really had a long love story.
What a great story. How many children did they ultimately have? How many siblings did you end up with?
2. One passed away when I was only 2 months old. And that was in Bolivia when they lived there. I was born there. And my sister her name was Marianne. She was 4 and passed away from what they think might have been rheumatic fever or malaria. They really didn't know. And penicillin wasn't available then. And She passed away. I never knew her.
Just as a little child.
Not even, because I was an infant.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
So, what was the quality of your father that made your mother fall for him? His strong athletic abilities, or what?
Definitely that, but mostly he is such a kind, gentle, loving human being. He was tough, He was not a bravo kind of guy. He was all man, but he's a sweet man. He was a good guy. He's just a good guy.
Tamara, let's talk.
Everyone.
Let's talk about him as your Yeah, let's talk about him as your grandfather. Go ahead. What did you call him? And in your eyes, what did he represent to you in your life?
No, I called him Opa, which is grandfather in German. Everybody actually. I mean, you didn't, obviously, but most people called him Opa. Anyone who was, I don't know, like 40 or younger called him Opa, it seemed like. Everyone seemed to meet him as Opa.
All our friends called him Opa.
Yeah. But he was, I was just to add on to what my mom was saying, like he had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. His heart was so huge. And he loved people. He loved getting to know people. He loved children. And I think that like men fell in love with him, women fell in love with him. Everybody who met him fell in love with him because he was just such a special, kind, warm, loving human. And he was also macho too, like he was, when my mom was saying it was all man, I think that's, what she meant in terms of like, he was strong, he was tough, but he had the sweetest, most gentle, warm heart. I mean, you couldn't ask for anything
definitely
more. And in my eyes, he was my hero. He was definitely my favorite man in this life.
And I wasn't the only person who liked to spend time with him. Your friends did too, is that right?
Oh, they adopted him. Everyone adopted him. They called him Opa. They formed separate friendships with him. People my age would take him out for lunch, invite him for dinner. I mean,
my friends were always over. My friends always wanted to be with him. I mean, as teenagers, you usually don't want to hang out with your parents and or your grandparents, but we did because they were cool and we liked them. We enjoyed them. My Opa was very, like I said before, he was just so warm and engaging and loving and all my girlfriends wanted. What's that?
He had the ability to invite someone to talk about themselves and to speak with them. I mean, he never really started a big discussion about anything, but if you asked him a question, as you probably found yourself, Scott, he had a lot to say about the question if he knew what we were talking about. But as a teenager myself, I'd have friends come over. They always met my parents, and we'd all end up sitting around our dining room table, and they were talking to my parents. They wanted to know their story, and they just loved him.
Did you get a sense that in his experience as a Jew who was in a Nazi concentration camp, that he was a rock of a man to endure it before he got there as a young man, or did his survival of it turn him into a rock?
Both. He was tough, and he was aware of what was going on in Germany at the time, and he got into some street scuffles. But when he got into Buchenwald, he said that within 10 minutes he knew he better control his temper, because you pushed him too far, he could have a temper. It was rare, but he could have one. He said he knew in 10 minutes if he couldn't control his anger and his upset over what he was seeing, he would be dead. And so that made a big impression on him.
Tamara, as a young woman growing up as this granddaughter that he treasured, do you remember him talking at all about any of those experiences in Germany with you, or did he sort of leave that behind?
No, see, Opa was really wonderful in that, he didn't lead. Hi, I'm Erwin. I'm Opa. Let me tell you, I was in a concentration camp. He didn't lead with it. But if you ever wanted to know anything, he was an open book. He shared. So as a child, I don't recall him just talking about it. But it was, I was a child of the 70s. And people weren't talking about it as much then as they were later on. And when I was more of a teenager, and in my early 20s, he spoke a lot about it. But he also started speaking to schools and universities, church groups, community.
That happened later in his life, because when they first came to this country, people didn't want to hear about it, and they didn't talk about it because people really just didn't want to acknowledge it, I think, to some level, and didn't know how to deal with it. So he didn't start talking about it until, as you said, Tamara, when you were a teenager, a young adult. He began to speak to school children when people found out his background, and say, "Oh, you have something to offer children," and it started while he was in Wyoming, really. So
yeah, because people would meet him and they would find that information out about him, and most people had never met anybody who had such an experience, let alone someone who was willing to speak about it. And so when they found out people would ask him if they would share the stories, and he was. And I think because he was just so honest about it, and caring with his presentation of it, I think and because of the kind of person he was, people felt like they could engage with him on it, and he would be okay to share.
And also, I think because of his accent, people would say, "Oh, where are you from?" and then it would just open up a whole story. So,
can you imitate his accent?
No, the only thing that Michael and I, my husband and I, we say it all the time. He used to have trouble with THs, so he would say, "I am thinking," but mostly when he wasn't thinking, he would say, "I'm thinking." So he was thinking.
So about it.
He made fun of himself about it,
It was this really pure German dialect of the American language when I interacted with him, and with the last name Deutsch.
Right.
It was easy to stereotype him as somebody who was just simply somebody who had come from Germany. But these stories are really important because he did learn through his life to meet people at their willingness. And I was like a can opener. I would just put another hole in the top of the can and ask to pour a little bit more of the juice out. And he was a willing participant. The way you said, Tamara, he would start to use that storytelling he got in school from telling schools their stories and his stories, that he would start to open up about it. Let's shift back to him just as the grandfather. He was very athletic. He was a skier. Did you go on any trips with him that were really compelling, that you remember fondly?
All the time. I always looked forward to our winter breaks, because we would, as a family, drive to Aspen, Colorado, before it was super fancy, and we would ski. So we would often drive to Denver. Oma and Opa would fly into Denver, right? And we'd pick them up, and then we would drive on to Aspen. That was before they lived where we lived in Chicago, or Evanston, actually. But yeah, I mean, those were some of the best memories that I have, when being a young child, when I didn't live with them, or when they didn't live in the same city. Because I just loved them so much, and skiing was so much fun, and Opa was an excellent skier, and as I said, he was my favorite man. So, I mean, I just always wanted to be with him.
We had a lot of laughs
even
sometimes over skiing.
But what's interesting
oh
is
my
you,
God.
you juxtapose those family things, and you were such a tight family with him using those skiing skills as a young man to help young people out of Germany over the mountains. I mean, that was a real thing he did, wasn't it?
Yes, couples, because at the time, Aryans could not date or marry Jews. So a lot of these couples did not want to break up. They knew they had to leave the country. And a lot of them were his friends. And so he would ski them over the border because he knew that border really, really well. And
when she
he must
says
have taken
skied them
about
over
20
the
people.
border, yeah, but when she says skied them over the border,
The
he
Czechoslovakian border.
he didn't just guide them. He put the woman on his back,
Right.
because the terrain was so rough, the slopes were so dangerous,
Right.
that he would put the woman on his back and ski her on his back, and often with a suitcase in each hand. And the man of the couple would, just ski and follow, because it was very dangerous.
Renata, some of your dad's family didn't make it. His sister and her
His
husband.
husband, yeah.
Yeah, what was there any of that was discussed over time? What did you feel about your family?
I knew it all my life that Gerda didn't get out. She married a very, very wealthy man into a very aristocratic family. They were philanthropists. They were really wealthy. And I think her husband, Heinz, felt he was so German. I don't think he really wanted to leave Germany. And I think he thought with his connections, he would manage to somehow avoid getting thrown out or sent to a concentration camp. And when everybody else got out, they were still trying to get out. And they just didn't make it. And my parents and my grandparents spent those 8 years in Bolivia when they lived there trying to locate them. But really, once the U.S. entered the war, there was no more communication. Letters stopped. The Red Cross, you couldn't get any information there. And my grandfather continued the rest of his life trying to find what happened to them. So it was,
as did Opa,
as did my father,
as did my grandfather,
right?
Mom's father.
So it was a painful loss to the family.
Many years later, they went back to Breslau and found letters and correspondence that your father translated. Was there any interesting story around that?
Well, the story of the letters didn't happen because he went back to Breslau. He went with my cousin, who found some letters in her mother's basement, my father's sister, Margot. And 3 little letters. And she said, what are these, Mom? And she said, oh, they're just some letters that we wrote each other. And she said, can you summarize these? And so she summarized them, but like with 3 sentences. And my cousin said, this can't be right. So she wrote to my uncle, my father's brother, and he almost did the same thing. He summarized these 3 letters. And she knew that just wasn't it. And so she went to my father and said, are there more family letters? And my father said, are you kidding? There are many, because in those days we all used carbon copies because it took so long for letters to get anywhere. We would not remember what we had written or what they had written. So everyone made letters copies of the letters they wrote. So he compiled them all, and there were 500 letters that went back and forth between all those siblings. It was amazing. And what he found in Breslau when he went back with my cousin Susie, a lot of information about the communication between Gerda and Heinz and the Nazis and how they took his property. And I mean, the man's family owned 15 estates that were just, you can't even picture it, it's Downton Abbey plus. And all that didn't help them, but the letters came from the family.
Same.
And my father was able to see the laws that were written, but no one had ever published all these laws. So he was hoping to be able to publish them because he researched it here at the university. There was no mention of the laws, the Nazi laws that were in effect.
And there was some translation of those that he did as well, yes?
Yes, but he never got them published, and that was before people could publish on their own, really. So that could probably still be done, or by now maybe somebody has done that. I don't know.
At one time, I took my family to Washington, D.C. to the Holocaust Museum, and he had some status with them. He provided me his passes because he said, I'm not going this year. I don't remember exactly what they were. Do you recall what his relationship there was with that with the museum?
There was a letter from the Kaiser that I'm gonna say this wrong. That pardoned Jews from way before, from the 1600s, etc. And we have a copy of it, and he made a copy and sent that to Yad Vashem as well. So they knew about that proclamation. I should look it up because
it's interesting.
Don't remember the exact name, but.
Well, Tamara, when I examined your Opa's eyes, it was never a time that he didn't express his pride in you. You're an accomplished actor in television, and I guess you've learned a lot from him that has become part of you. What would you say has been something you've applied to your abilities in your successful career?
Well, my grandfather was a very honest person, and it's so funny. People are always say, actors, it's just, you can lie, you're an actor. And I'm like, I'm a terrible liar. And to me, acting is about telling the truth. It's about being honest. It's about being as true to what is going on as one can be. So, I mean, I guess in terms of my career and my craft, I take that, but I feel like Opa and I had a really special, very, very special bond. And his heart and his love, and I don't know, I'm a little teary right now, but just who he was as a person, I feel like I was so blessed to have in my life that I don't know, like I just feel like I carry him with me in pretty much everything I do at some level. So I can't say exactly in terms of my career, but I think an integrity and an honesty and a strong work ethic. He had a very, very strong work ethic.
Now that honesty and integrity just comes through so much. I'm so thrilled that you said that. Renate, did your father allow his time in Buchenwald to define him?
No, only to the extent that he said, he drew a line in his mind. He said, that was then. It was horrible beyond words, but I will not let a day go by where I had a bad dream. That was then, this is now. Because if I let myself dwell on what I saw, what I heard, what I experienced, I'll go insane. And so he just put it behind him. And the only way that it became part of him was, I think, his strength, his resolve, his self-discipline, his humanity. I mean, he, in that way, it certainly had an impact on his life. But
Tamara, do you have anything to add there?
Didn't he say I'll always remember, but I won't let it haunt me.
Exactly.
Exactly. Those words. And I think that, he had he knew, as you were saying, that if he didn't control his own mind with it and put it in a place where he wouldn't forget, but he wouldn't be haunted by it, that he would, like you said.
He had incredible willpower, and I think that was always a part of him. He was a smoker, and one day when some doctor finally said to him, "You really shouldn't smoke," he said, "Okay," threw it away, and that was it. And the man was a heavy smoker. I mean, when he made a decision, that was it, and you could count on him. You could count on him.
And he would say, "It's not willpower, it's won't power."
That's right.
That's great.
Don't need willpower, won't power. Right.
To be clear, I want to tell his story along with you, because not that he was somebody who experienced a concentration camp and made it through, but because of that impact he has had on others, myself and the many of your family and friends that he met over the course of his life. So my last question for you is, what should our younger generations here in America think about a man who had that won't power to, put the bad things to the side and go forward? Because I think that would be what he would want everyone to know about his story. Can each of you give me a last point about that? What would the message from him be now today to younger people?
Whoa, what America is going through right now is a little hard to answer that question. I think he would be very upset at what's happened in America right now. I know when he was talking to school children, they would write him letters. There's one young girl, I think she was in middle school, and a young Black girl, and she wrote him this letter, and she was so afraid that what would happen if slavery came back. And he was just so kind to her, and he said he really did not think that would happen, and that she needs to just go forward in her life and know that, she can do more than she thinks she can do, and not to let that stay in her mind. But, I still have some of those letters somewhere.
Tamara?
I think that, I agree with Mom. I think that, he would be, as so many of us are, really upset at the way things are presently and have been in the past few years, with the rise of white supremacy and some strangely acceptance of it. But in terms of what I think he would want for young people and what he would share is that, is to be an honorable person, to do what the best you can be, because I think that when you are good to people and you live by a certain set of values and you have integrity and you share that with others, that it spreads. I think he would, because he stood up for what he believed in, and he was brave in who he was and his experiences, and he never he never wanted anyone, he believed in equality, and he believed in justice. And we see, we're humans, and since the dawn of humans, there have been good and bad forces. There has been right and wrong. There has been fair and unfair. And I think it will always continue. But I think that he would say that you have to stand by what you believe in, and you have to be a person of integrity and care about others.
I think that is a great way to close. Renata and
Yeah.
Tamara, thank you for these tremendous stories. I'm so proud of your work to keep his legacy alive and to help me tell his stories. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for caring about him so much and wanting to share about him.
Yeah.
We really loved him.
It's my pleasure. My many thanks to Renate Bennett and Tamara Braun. So there you have it, the story of my favorite patient, my most impactful patient, Mr. Erwin Deutsch. I'm so glad I knew the man and understood what a deep love of life looks like, and that I was able to reach back in time with him to explore the unexplorable. To the audience, thanks for listening to these stories. I'm sure you have your own version of the most impactful patient you've ever encountered, so please share it with me. And to my old friend, Mr. Deutsch, thank you for letting me tell your stories. Until my next Sandbox story, be great at all you do.